Molly Maple by J.W. Garland. Part 1. Blue Hen Ridge. Molly Maple was a girl who lived just down the street from me in the little town I grew up. She lived at 15 Apple Church Lane, 5 houses down from me, in our cul-de-sac. This was in a small town in Middle America called Crane Lake. But, like Molly, it's as if the town, itself, has also since disappeared. That's what we writers call foreshadowing. For a few days after her 10th birthday, little Molly Maple vanished. Crane Lake wasn't so unlike many of the other small, rural, fishing towns that spotted the backwoods of Middle America, but the one main difference between Crane Lake and all those other places was its history, and how it was built upon superstition, folklore, and haunted campfire stories. The place was lame, basking in its own mythopoeia. The town's founders, the Barracloths, amidst others, their surnames lost to time, were said to be devout in their belief in the occult, the fables and fairy tales usually reserved for the young. However, there, in Crane Lake, it seemed everyone, and everything, clung to urban legends as if they were, in fact, the great gospel. Of all the haunted spots, those places of twilight, and ghastly apparitions, none so were as infamous as Blue Hen Ridge Road, and its adjoining, ancestral cemetery. That is where the Barracloths, and all the first pilgrims to colonize Crane Lake were said to be laid to rest. All there, in lone, under their cairns and crosses. The entire locale is told to be one of the most haunted of places in all of Crane Lake, let alone in all of the smaller hamlets bespeckling America's back roads, alcoves, and foothills. Speaking of Blue Hen Ridge Cemetery, I'd be remiss if I forgot to mention good old Uncle Jack. He was indeed dignitary there. However, he was no man, but a large, fearsome crow, eyes as dark as the things that lurk deep in the bowers of every man's heart. For as long as anyone could remember, Uncle Jack would sit, perched upon the shoulder of a big Arab scarecrow, his tattered peacoat whipping in the wind, his tricorn hat, somehow, managing never be blown from atop his burlap head. There were many a yarn spun of Uncle Jack and his companion, the scarecrow, but those can be left for another day. Crane Lake, through all of its local superstition and practices, still seemed a bright place during my youth. The black never dwelt upon the surface of our small township. It just lurked beneath, like a malaise, waiting to burp its foul murk throughout the cracks in our crumbling roads, just like crabgrass or a determined weed. That was before the disappearance of Molly Maple, before the darkness subjugated our community. I remember, with much fondness, the apple harvest and the following festival. Crane Lake was known for its apples, and each year after harvest, a festival would commence, as well, a parade. There would even be a little Miss Apple Harvest crowned. She'd be given the opportunity to ride on a small parade float, bedecked with diadem and apple crozier, waving to the townsfolk as the Crane Lake Elementary School band marched behind, butchering what may or may not have been our town's anthem. I can't quite remember. Crane Lake, I wouldn't say, was any type of tourist destination, not in the least. But, sometimes, during festival season, when there were various roadside stands erected, all with innumerable apple sundries, especially pies, apple mead, apple juice, apple cider, you get the point, travellers, just passing through to a better destination, would usually stop to purchase the various apple products and decorum. Of this, I mean, the strange, withered apple-headed dolls that old Lady Adelaide used to create and sell. In my younger, and more formative years, I always found myself afraid of those shrivel-headed dolls that Mrs. Adelaide made. Where most saw whimsy, with their tiny flannel shirts, jeans, and rotten, crozzled apple heads, I saw the cycle of life and death. What was once ripe and thriving, red and delicious, sat then in its state of preserved decay, their faces, etiolated, held in time, looking vaguely of the haggard faces of old men, or walnuts. Crane Lake was indeed apple country. There, everyone had their own take and recipe for apple pie and would square off against one another in the annual apple pie bake-off. And of course, no apple festival would be complete without an apple pie eating contest. Even the sign leading into our town read Crane Lake, home of the famous Crane Lake Apple Festival. For years, our fair apple town seemed as if a hermitage, cut off from the burgeoning wrongness that lurked just beyond our invisible, candid apple walls. Aside from the dark lore that the town was founded upon, it was the picture-perfect image of small-town America. If you'd seen the place in a photograph or a postcard, you'd most likely fancy a visit. But the vanishing of Molly Maple changed all that. It changed our town and everyone who resided therein. Especially me. I must admit, I, being a few years older, didn't know the girl well, if I knew her at all. I do remember catching short glimpses of her running to catch up to the ice cream truck on those muggy summer afternoons of our youth. Her long, black hair at play amidst the breeze like it were dancing along to the ice cream man's clacky calliope song, her flowered, autumn dress, as well, joining in, fluttering, like the butterflies surround. Times were easier then, before Molly's disappearance. Myself, Tommy and Jim would spend our days in joviality, down by the old cutter's mill, catching crayfish from the creek in our rusted, tin buckets. If not there, we'd loiter downtown, about Fat Mario's pizza shop, or the ye oldie-fashioned coin-operated arcade. Jim's uncle Reggie worked part-time at the arcade and would sometimes give us free snow cones, candied apples, or lemonade from the concession booth. Other times he'd pay out of his own pocket so we could watch the varied automata dance, sing, or do whatever it is they did. My favourite was the mechanical girl. She was fashioned in Victorian garb, with a parasol, curtsying, blowing kisses and doing pirouettes. Another, I fondly recall, was the Oracle. He resembled an ancient, oriental mystic, or wizard, with an exceedingly long, grey moustache. He sat encased in a box, behind a window, like he was selling you tickets to some mechanical puppet theatre play. Once you'd paid your coin, he'd slowly come to life. With yellow eyes alight, breathing smoke. He'd speak in a monotonous, automatistic voice. Whom dareth disturb me from mine 1,000-year slumber? Something reminiscent of those words. He'd then print a little white card that read much like a Chinese fortune cookie. Sometimes they forgot to restock the cards and you'd get nothing at all. I remember believing that to be a bad omen, a fortune dictating you had no future at all. Had Molly been one of those people whom had no fortune, no little white card, no future? It was on one of those long, sweltering summer days that Molly Maple disappeared. I remember it well because the temperature was a record high for us out there in the sticks. Mr. Foster's ice cream truck pretty much ran non-stop. Pop Goes the Weasel was our song of summer, our song of youth, and perhaps its requiem as well. To say Molly's disappearance shook our town to its very foundation would be an understatement. Much like small towns are, and especially back then, no one could imagine anything like that could ever happen. Crane Lake was the kind of place where no one locked their doors and it was safe for children to play outside even after dark. That all changed with Molly Maple. It was with her that the tatty, black drapery had fallen over Crane Lake. Jim, Tommy, myself, and a kid we only knew as Turner from the other side of town were riding our bikes just down off of Blue Hen Ridge Road when we heard the news. Blue Hen Ridge was full of all sorts of dilapidated structures. From barns, to silos, to windmills that still spun and creaked, though vermiculated and rust-begotten. The trees there even seemed never to give life to leaves. There were deathly apples still somehow clinging to gnarled branches, dehydrated and blackened, more so than even the heads of Mrs. Adelaide Downs' dolls. I wondered then how those rotting apples in the trees were somehow able to sustain themselves. Why they hadn't fallen to the earth below and melted away into the dirt. Even with the flies inundating it, buzzing, and the insects constantly feeding upon its dead, black angle. Blue Hen Ridge was a somber and haunted locale that basically died with the dawning of the Industrial Revolution. It also was the site of the Blue Hen Ridge Cemetery, as I'd aforementioned. The cemetery itself hadn't been used to plant corpses for generations. Most of the stones there were so ravaged by time, one was barely able to decipher their script. It was told to me by my grandfather, Ridolfo. Many of those graves belonged generally to the one family line, the Bearcloth family, who tended those lands since the town's inception. A memory that has long followed me, something I'd spoken upon before, was that of the large crow that all the children would refer to as Old Uncle Jack, whom always could be spied, perched upon a longevous and fossilized scarecrow, just along the outskirts of the cemetery's cobblestone walls. It was said that Ole Uncle Jack kept vigil over the old Bearcloth place, as he was as old as the ruins themselves. If anyone got too close to him, or attempted vandalism upon the Bearcloth house, Jack would squawk and caw, flapping madly his dust-riddled wings. The dander that fell was said to not be dander at all, nor dust, but grave dirt, for old Uncle Jack was as dead as that place he inhabited. That place called Blue Hen Ridge. His scarecrow companion, on his crux, always seemed to sway and creak in his tricorn hat, even when there was no breeze at all. His loosely fit peacoat flapping like mother's laundry, drying upon the clothesline in mid-afternoon. His head was somewhat a merger between pumpkin and burlap, with button eyes and a crudely stitched grin, giving the impression he were in on a joke that no one aside from himself and Jack understood. It was there, in Blue Hen Ridge, on a blisteringly bright summer afternoon, that word came over Tommy's small, yellow, Philco radio, that little Molly Maple had gone missing. She'd disappeared as an apparition into mist. All three of us listened intently to the broadcast, as nothing of interest ever took place in our small town of Crane Lake. We all sat in a somewhat triangular formation, legs crossed, like we were back in kindergarten on Mrs. Abernathy's magic carpet. We listened to the newsman's voice with all the excite and intrigue we'd done our schoolma'am when she'd read from her big book of elfish tales. I laggardly drew semicircles in the dirt whilst I listened. Clockwise, then counterclockwise, and so on. I did this, and now I realize it must have been a nervous tic of some kind. As I hung upon the newscaster's words, hoping they were spurious in nature, I found myself having switched to spirals. I looked upon my trusty, rusty razor knife, as I drew it through the dirt, and it occurred to me that I'd carried it in my pocket for as long as I could remember. And I had no remembrance of how I'd come upon it. But, for reasons unknown to me at the time, I held it like it were a four-leaf clover, coveting it as if it's some magical properties, or secret to divulge. Apparently, Molly had been playing in the sprinklers in her front yard when it happened. I imagined, on that day, she'd be waiting, like all of the other children on our cul-de-sac, salivary glands oozing in anticipation, for good old Mr. Foster's ice cream mobile to round the corner. If memory serves, I recollect she'd always purchase a blue popsicle fashioned in the shape of a ghost, with 2 crimson gumballs for eyes. She'd always also buy, in accompaniment, a set of brightly carmine, candid wax Dracula fangs. Why I recollect these things with such lucidity, I certainly haven't clue, but in those days of summer, everything seemed so shine and vivid. I can see her through my kaleidoscopic, childlike lens. I can still see the ghost pop melting there in her pale, fairy-like fingers, and upon her summer-chafen lips. I recall her whimsical nature as she'd put those wax lips in her mouth and chase the other ice cream urchins about the truck, with arms outstretched, like some sort of kissing monster. Their laughter held in time, in repetition, an echo in the mouseoldom of our childhood. Our innocence. We were under one of the several rotting, rusty windmills, shrouding ourselves from the searing, scowling sun, as those words came through the crackling hiss of Tommy's small, yellow radio. And I remembered her then, as I do now, the girl that lived 5 houses down from me, at the end of our cul-de-sac. The little girl who loved ice pops. The little girl who changed my life forever. Though my mind was reeling, the others cared not, especially for Turner, who'd not known the girl at all, having been from across town, as his nickname suggested, and really, he was more so Jim's friend than mine. Even though I'd not known Molly Maple, and we'd spoken but only fleeting words, there was always something about her strange, angelic eyes. When the newsman said her name, through the buzzing haze, I thought of her moon-glow green eyes, her soft freckles, and her long, black hair, that seemed as if always caught in an updraft. A picture of pure benevolence adorning the attic walls of my mind. I'd hoped that it was only a misunderstanding, that she'd wandered off for some reason or another and she'd turn up not too long after that newscast aired. That was only wishful thinking, of course, but could I make that wish manifest? I pictured her standing there in a vast sea of dandelions, whispering her secrets, those that only I could know. Each dandelion but another chance to bring her back safely to her mother and father, to her little house on Apple Church Lane. And it was through the wish from a flower that I sought refuge. Each time from that day forth, every time I saw a dandelion, I'd pluck it from out its place in the loam. And with warm breath, I'd blow and recite these words to myself in silent prayer: please, let Molly Maple come home. I'd watch the white particles disperse into the atmosphere before me, and I'd hope one of those floral strands would find its way to her and bring her back to us. Bring her back to me.